Do you ever get pain in the front of the shoulder when you're doing a landmine press? This is one of the reasons why that may happen. And here are a couple of variations we can use in order to reduce the tension on the front of the shoulder. So before we get into different variations of the landmine press, let's talk about some of the reasons why you may feel this discomfort in the front part of your shoulder. Whenever I have a client that has anterior shoulder discomfort, usually I'm looking at a couple measurements or a couple movements. First, their ability to flex their shoulder overhead. A lot of times when people are doing a landmine press, especially if they're doing it in like a half kneeling position where they're kneeling down or they're leaning into it too much, sometimes they don't have that shoulder flexion mobility just to be able to get into that position. And so what you'll see as they're doing a landmine press is they'll round their shoulder forward, they'll arch their back, they'll hike their shoulder, they'll do some kind of compensation in order to get around that movement. And so that puts a lot of pressure on the anterior part of the shoulder because of that position change of the shoulder itself. The other thing that I commonly see is an inability to internally rotate the shoulder. So when I'm coming down into this landmine position, I'm going to need some degree of internal rotation. And when I'm pressing, I'm also going to need that internal rotation. If I don't have it, again, I'm going to have similar compensations to that lack of shoulder flexion. I'm going to round the shoulder forward. I may bend the wrist when I'm holding on to the landmine, and I may put the elbow out towards the side more because I don't have the space in the front of my shoulder. So I'm trying to find it out towards the side by kicking that elbow out towards the side. So because of that, we have to think about different variations in order to overcome those type of limitations and to make sure that we're in a position that allows us to actually press and not go into certain compensations. But before we get into some of the variations, let's talk about certain cueing that we can use to see if maybe it's a cueing issue. Okay, so a couple key things that we need to think about with the landmine press is, first of all, we need to think about the shoulder position. A lot of times I'll see people who have their shoulder really tucked in towards their body, or it's flared out towards the side excessively. We kind of want it in that 45-degree range. And the reason for that is that's how our humerus or our arm bone sits in the socket. It sits in the socket in a bit of an angle. And so this 45-degree range allows for this co-contraction of the muscles in the front and the back to stabilize the shoulder and allow for the shoulder and the shoulder blade to move effectively. The other thing too is I don't want my wrist to be bent like that. As I said, this is usually a compensation for a lack of internal rotation of the shoulder, this wrist extension, because we can't maintain that position. Again, as we go there, we start to internally rotate. So we do this in order to compensate. So really make sure you have a strong wrist. So you're not letting it bend excessively. So I've got the elbow out towards the side. I've got a strong wrist. In terms of where I kind of want this landmine positioning, I don't want to be too close. I also don't want to be too far. So what I usually do is I'll do like a fist difference from my shoulder. That's kind of a good setup position to make sure the shoulder's loaded and stable while I'm pressing. The other thing to consider is the stance when we're doing this landmine press. So you'll have some people who have this parallel stance. Sometimes you'll have a staggered stance with the same leg back, or other times you'll have a staggered stance with the front leg forward. Let's talk a little bit about that. When I have this bilateral stance, as I'm pressing, I'm going to be kind of pushing towards the other side. This is a great strategy just to start because it gives you this wider base support, so it's a lot more stable. With that being said, if people have tension on the front part of the shoulder, just to give them more space, I actually like to have them with a wider stance, but this same leg back. And the reason for that is that it's going to allow me to shift back a little bit, and it's going to reduce the angle in which I'm pressing. Like I said, if we have a limitation in shoulder flexion, then coming up too high is going to put me into this compensation. It's going to cause my shoulder to be in a position that may have overloading on the front. So having this slight stagger allows me to sit back into this back heel and reduces the amount of shoulder flexion I go into. Versus if I were to go into the opposite side where the same leg is forward as I'm pressing, well, what's going to happen is as I press, my body's going to want to turn away from this side. I can't sit back because the front leg's forward, so it's pushing me towards the back leg, which is the other side, and that's actually going to put me in deeper range of shoulder flexion because it's going to cause the scapula, the shoulder blade, to ride up a little bit more. Again, which could put some additional load to the front part of the shoulder if it's already bothering you. And so now let's talk about two different variations we can use in order to mitigate some of these compensations. So the first exercise is going to be a seated landmine press, and I'm sitting on a bit of a higher box because what that's going to do is it's not going to put me too much of hip flexion, so it's going to allow me to get a little bit more support for when I'm pressing overhead. Sometimes when we're standing, it could be a little bit hard to coordinate our feet, our hips, our mid part of our body with the overhead press. Whereas when I'm seated, I could get a little bit more of this base support to push off of. I can sit back a little bit more, again, just to make sure I'm not going to do too deep a shoulder flexion. And I can also push myself back as I'm pressing. But essentially what this is going to do is going to allow me to create a better base support, allow me to press, and that's going to allow me to improve not only shoulder flexion, but also internal rotation of the shoulder. So the second exercise is going to actually be something we talked about before, which is this staggered stance, this wider staggered stance position. So my feet are going to be outside of hip width apart, more towards shoulder width. It's going to give me a better base support so that when I'm pressing, I'm also going to think about pushing myself back towards the back heel. So I'm not going to lean into it as I press. I'm going to think about pushing myself back in towards my heel, making sure I'm staying heel heavy the whole time. That's going to mitigate how much shoulder flexion I go into. It's also going to keep my ribs locked down so I don't flare excessively. And so it's going to, again, reinforce the opening in the front part of the shoulder while opening up the back as I press, because it's going to shift me back towards my heel. So the landmine press is an exercise that I commonly use within my programming, but it's important to understand that everybody is different in terms of how they move. Using an effective assessment to identify what variation is best for your client is going to be really impactful. That's what I talk about in my Evolve Biomechanics mentorship. So check that out in the link below. And thank you so much for watching. If you like this, don't forget to like, save, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.